Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistonomy. My name is Uzair Yunus, and if you've been listening to this podcast, we focused for the last few weeks quite a bit on Pakistan and what's going on there with the economy, with politics, with constitutional amendments, the role of the opposition. But I think today we're going to zoom out a bit and talk about something that I've been meaning to have a conversation on for a while. And that's about what's going on in the realm of geopolitics and whether, a question that's frequently asked by my friends, by others in conversations and on social media, whether we're entering into a broader global conflict, World War III, some may say it provocatively. And to talk about this today, somebody whose views on geopolitics that I follow quite closely and admire, and I think you should as well, is Dr. Kamran Bokhari. He's been on this podcast before, but for those of you who don't know, he's the senior director of the Eurasian Security and Prosperity portfolio at the New Lines Institute. He's also served as director of the Analytical Department there from 2019 to 2023, and is also a national security and foreign policy specialist at the University of Ottawa's Professional Development Institute. Somebody whose writings, whose work on geopolitics, where things are headed, are very, very interesting and must read. So, Dr. Bukhari, welcome back to Pakistonomy, and thanks for taking out the time today.
Thanks for having me, Uzair. Always a pleasure. I love following your podcast, so it's great to be on it.
I want to begin with this thing that right before this conversation, I opened up the CFR conflict tracker, right, which I'll link in the description for those of you who want to dive deeper into this as well. Other organizations have this. The Crisis Group has a similar one, for example. And I was looking at the map, and if I go from sort of far east, right, I start seeing conflicts heating up. So in Japan, the Russians are buzzing Japanese planes. The Australians are on a quest to get nuclear submarines. In the South China Sea, you have Chinese naval vessels and Filipino naval vessels and even Japanese vessels and American vessels sort of getting into some form of agitation on and off for the foreseeable or for the in the recent past. And then you look at Myanmar conflict heating up. You look at India's eastern flank in Manipur, for example, conflict heating up. Bangladesh just happened in terms of it blew up as a what some people in both India and in Bangladesh say was a regime change operation by the same Donald Lu that people in Pakistan are familiar with, for example. You go north into the Himalayas, the China-India conflict is frozen, but still, they're engaging in terms of building more infrastructure and more capability. They're both in a quest for that. Kashmir militancy growing again, and there's question marks being asked by both New Delhi and Islamabad in terms of where we go from here. Afghanistan, again, becoming a hotbed of terrorism, casualties in Pakistan spiking because of that. Western Europe, with Ukraine sort of being now the front line of the Russia West conflict, very hot. The Russians took a new town. Comes out into the Middle East, is in front of everybody. Iran and Israel now engaging in what somebody I was talking to this morning called a regional war. He says the media is not calling it, policymakers don't want to call it, but essentially we're in a regional war at this point with the exchange of missiles and drones, etc., and airstrikes. So Israel's gone into Lebanon, it's in Gaza, Yemen, the Houthis in the Red Sea challenging. Then you come down into Sudan, and Central Africa, essentially a hot mess there as well in terms of the violence and the scale of conflicts. And that's the Eurasian sort of sphere, essentially, the landmass and the naval sort of situation there. How do you see this? Are we entering or have we entered a global conflict and we're not recognizing it, or is this still in flux from your point of view?
So, Uzair, I think it's a bit of both. I think there are similarities in terms of patterns between what is happening in the here and now and what preceded the First World War and definitely preceded the Second World War. We talk about the Second World War more so because that's recent history, and then the international rules-based order was established right after the conclusion of World War II. But if you look at both of them, there are similarities in terms of patterns, but there are also serious differences. So one of the biggest difference is that in both global conflicts of the 20th century, you had states that were more or less equal to one another in terms of, there were peer competitors. militarily, economically, and their political structures. But you don't see that in today's world. Doesn't mean that we're not in some sort of a global conflict. I think we're sort of tiptoeing, or some would say now we're galloping towards it. But there is that sort of difference. And that difference is that there wasn't a sole superpower during that time period with the ability to field a military on a global scale, particularly maritime power. I'm talking about the United States. You also have then two other peer competitors, if you will, Russia and China. If you look at Russia, while it is now making progress in its attempts to push deeper and deeper into Ukraine, at least over the past 2 to 3 months, perhaps even the last quarter. But by and large, this is something different than what we've seen from the Russian military capabilities since the conflict broke out, since they invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. So, and if you're Russia and you're reliant on North Korea and the likes of Iran to beef up and augment your firepower, then that speaks volumes about your weakness. Everything is relative, but I just wanted to highlight that. And then under sanctions, we didn't have this situation prior to either of the first two world wars. It wasn't a superpower. Russia was not as weak as it is. Yes, it had the ups and downs in both. During the First World War, we had the Bolshevik Revolution, so there was that affected Russian behavior during the war. And then, of course, you have the initial setback because of the Nazi military machine that pushed deep into the Soviet Union, and now in present-day Ukraine. And you see the parallels that the Putin government and Putin himself makes with that time period and calls his opponents Nazis and
And the
whatnot.
internal upheaval with like Stalin and the officers cleansing that he did, which set back the military machine as the Nazis were coming in as well.
Absolutely. Let's switch to China. China is the world's second largest economy, but it's not yet a military power in that sense. The Chinese have not fought. It's in pure military terms. You either have the experience, and the experience comes from fighting wars, or you don't, and you have a potential latent capability, mostly judged based on how much hardware you have, how much technology, and then of course your how much muscle you flex. So that's one part of what shapes Chinese the status of the Chinese as a military power. The second is which is now very obvious to everybody, which is the Chinese economy is not doing well. And yes, there's a lot of talk of Taiwan and the Chinese Coast Guard ramming their boats and vessels with the Filipino Coast Guard, making noise with the Vietnamese. There's some tension going on with Malaysia and whatnot. And then you also have the Chinese doing joint exercises. The past 4 or 5 months have seen multiple joint exercises all along sort of the Western Pacific seaboard, running right from the South China Sea all the way north through Taiwan, through the sea of the waters around Japan, and even the Aleutian Islands, which is now U.S.-Canada territory. You're basically poking there strategically. But the fact of the matter is, this is all new. And are the Chinese, what is more important for the Chinese? The Chinese need to do all these things in order to, develop the capability long term. But at the current sort of priority is to fix the economy, and fixing the economy requires an understanding with the United States, which is why we've had a series of diplomatic meetings between Beijing and Washington, going back to last summer when Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen first went to China. And then we saw the Xi Biden meeting in San Francisco, and then all, senior top officials, military and civil from Washington have paid visits to Beijing and vice versa. So I think that is the priority. Which is why I'm a bit hesitant to say, but I want to, end my comment on this thought. Look, we don't know what's in the future, but it's quite possible that we go into a conflict and a major global conflict. And historians or people looking back 30, 50, 100 years from now will look back at the early 2020s and say, this was the beginning of the third big global conflict. Maybe it'll be called World War III, who knows? But I just want to leave that thought because how you construct the narrative and how you look back at history and how it is sort of told is very different from what is happening at the time, unless it picks up momentum.
Yeah, that's a very important point, right? Because one thing that I've been thinking about is, history doesn't repeat itself so much as it rhymes. That's what often my professors would keep saying in grad school as well. And I keep going back to that lesson. And
Something
also
attributed to Mark Twain.
yeah, and so also it's like, you kind of see in the past that things played out a certain way, and there are some parallels, but there are also big differences. You were alluding to the relative power gap, etc. One thing I think of also is like when I think about First World War and the Second World War, a lot of times what also happens is that your assumptions about what is going to happen based on precedent don't really pan out, right? So in the case of the First World War, trench warfare, the Maginot Line, people thought, particularly the French thought, that because we had hardened so much that line, second conflict with the Germans coming, they weren't going to sweep over Western Europe and the way they did, but the tanks were introduced at that point, right? And in the Second World War, then you saw US naval supremacy and power projection capability, particularly through air war, but also naval aircraft carriers, allowing that to happen through naval and air capabilities. That has stayed in play. And I know you and I have had this conversation offline a bit as well, that we're now entering a phase where asymmetric weapons, for example, the kind of missiles the Iranians are now deploying, or the drones that are being seen increasingly deployed in Ukraine and also in Azerbaijan and Armenia, we've seen part of that, this preview, right? Makes the cost of the legacy power projection architecture, i.e., these big, bulky naval capabilities through aircraft carriers, etc., kind of like sitting ducks because of the relative, cost gap, and like you can just flood the zone and take out that asset because it's just a sitting duck in a sea or in an ocean. How do you think about the evolution of warfare and the evolution of asymmetric capabilities, sort of shrinking the relative power gap in terms of the capabilities, let's say United States or an Iran or China may have? Like, yes, on paper, nowhere near the same projection capabilities, but they have developed asymmetric means which could perhaps change the very nature of the relative power balance because of that innovation.
Yes, absolutely. And I think you raise a very critical point. And let me give some examples. So you mentioned Azerbaijan. And yes, the Bayraktar drone and its variants that Turkey supplied Baku with played a key role in shaping the outcome of that war. The Azerbaijanis, after trying to get back their territory for 28 years that Armenia had captured. I'm talking about Nagorno-Karabakh. They finally were able to have a decisive victory over their Armenian rivals and took the entire territory back, which they had lost for 3 decades since 1994. And so, the drones played a huge role. Yes, of course, now, the Armenians are right to say that the Russians were just sort of not, they were absent, they were missing in action. They didn't come to their aid, which is creating all sorts of problems between Erevan and Moscow. But the fact remains that there was a weapon that allowed the Azerbaijanis to make a certain degree of progress in the battle space to where they could leverage and gain an edge over their adversary. So that's one example. Another example is what we're watching. And this example actually cuts both ways. So if you look at Iran, uh, Iran has sort of, probably written the book on asymmetric warfare. Because it's not a conventional power, it realized early on that if it's going to become an adversary and challenge US domination or the US dominance in the Middle East, then it has to come up with some other form of war-making capabilities. So it crafted this entire what they call the axis of resistance, which is essentially proxy warfare and asymmetric capabilities.
In part helped by the neocons in Washington, D.C., who gifted them Iraq and that capability in the first place.
Well, absolutely. I mean, big powers make huge blunders, and the Iraq War. I don't know who else is left who will argue that that wasn't a blunder. If you waged a war and it led to the creation of something called ISIS, and Iraq fell in the Iranian orbit, then it's a blunder no matter how you look at it. So yes, but if you go back to the asymmetric warfare capabilities that the IRGC has developed, both itself, the speedboats, for as an example, in the Persian Gulf waters. There's a division of labor between the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps Navy that is based on asymmetric capabilities, and it is responsible for operations inside the Persian Gulf, and everything beyond the Straits of Hormuz is the responsibility with conventional naval capabilities of Artesh, the regular Iranian armed forces. But inside the Gulf, the Iranians have developed these asymmetric capabilities. On top of that, much more pronounced is the proxy network that they created, first in Lebanon, then in Iraq, then in Syria, and most recently with the Houthis in Yemen. So you see, for example, the Houthis launching attacks. So one of the reasons why the former head of the Quds Force, the overseas operations arm of the IRGC, was taken out by the United States in early 2020 is because the IRGC-QF had built up Houthi capability to the point where people will remember in late 2019, I forget the month, but the Houthis launched a drone attack striking at the oil facility in Saudi Arabia in the city of Abqaiq and took out half of the country's oil production. So that was a huge escalation on the part of the Iranians, but again, showing that you don't have to do it yourself. You don't have to have an air force. You can have your proxy sitting somewhere else on the southern flank of Saudi Arabia, strike at the kingdom. The Houthis have also struck at least once in a very noteworthy way at UAE as well. And those ballistic and cruise missile attacks on Saudi Arabia on its west coast, Jeddah, and targeting Riyadh and whatnot, those have happened in the past, which led to the Saudi-led coalition essentially negotiating with the Houthis and literally ceding the port of Hodeidah to the Houthis. They had laid siege, and the expectation at the time was that they would actually take the port away in the early days. But the siege went on, and the Houthis used asymmetric capabilities to force the hand of the Saudis and the UAE. And the result was that they had to cede that port. And now, the rest is history. The Houthis are now projecting power both in the Arabian Sea and in the Red Sea, especially since October 7th. And what this has become is a major challenge for Central Command. U.S. Central Command now has to expend a great deal of resources to basically keep the Houthis contained.
Who have been shooting down MQ-9 Reaper drones as well. I think last count was
Exactly.
3 or 4 in the recent past.
Exactly. And so it's not like they're overwhelming Central Command and the US naval capabilities, but this isn't something that Central Command had necessarily factored in that they would be doing for the long haul. And we've seen waves of airstrikes conducted by the US and its allies. But they haven't taken out, they haven't neutralized the capability. So this is an ongoing thing. So there is that example. Finally, I want to sort of close this thought, this question with this thought that I think what the Israelis have demonstrated is the reverse, is that yes, we're faced with asymmetric warfare, but they have also used technology and intelligence capabilities, creative ways, in order to reassert conventional dominance. Because if you look at what has happened to Hezbollah, if you look at what's happening between Iran and Israel, that says a lot about the relevance well into the future of a conventional military capability and the limits of asymmetric warfare.
Yeah, that's a very good point, right? And I think part of the thing that I'm looking at also, as you mentioned, Yemen and Saudi Arabia sort of ceding that space. Again, like if you go back to the beginning of the Saudi Houthi conflict, the Saudis, Crown Prince MBS, famously, I think, quoted by John Brennan himself, believed that this would be done in 2 weeks. And lo and behold, it wasn't the case, and the asymmetric war dragged on. And we're seeing similar indications in Gaza right now, where to this day, like Hamas is able to attack Israeli forces, even though most of the Gaza Strip has been flattened by Israel. And now we'll see what they're going into Lebanon in terms of what they're able to do. But that leads me to my second question, which was going to be focused more on this thing that I'm sure you heard John Mearsheimer talk about constantly as well, that smaller powers like Israel are trying to drag the United States into a conflict with Iran. And other smaller powers like Hamas and Hezbollah, Hamas in particular, try to drag Hezbollah and then by extension Iran into a conflict. And again, that takes us back to the historical parallel, right? That a lot of times is these smaller powers, particularly in the pre-World War I era, with like different competing interests and relative power balance or multipolarity, can suck you into a conflict before you know it. How do you assess this whole situation in terms of like, and we see Sudan, we haven't even touched on that, where the UAE essentially is fighting a prolonged and really violent war conflict through its proxies with regards to the RSF. How do you see the chessboard set up right now in terms of the relative power balance in the region, in particular the Middle East and sort of the Red Sea, Persian Gulf region, where smaller powers backed by bigger powers essentially are making moves that perhaps might drag in a larger power into the conflict in so many ways?
So that's an important question, and let me try to answer that by the following. A few months ago, I read a op-ed that was penned by former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who is actually hoping that, in the future, he will, once again get a shot at that, the top job in the country. He was talking about the conflict with Iran. And I think this goes back into early spring, he wrote this piece. The argument of that piece is uh, we being Israel, needs the United States help to meet the challenge of Iran because it's not an Israeli capability to do that. And what do I mean by that? Or what does he mean by that? Uh, Look, the Israeli Air Force has overwhelming superiority when it comes to its immediate strategic environments. But even in the case of the Houthis, and granted that the Houthis don't pose the kind of threat to Israel that Hezbollah does in terms of its ability to fire rockets given proximity and that geographic distance. But even with the Houthis, we've only seen 2 incidents of Israeli airstrikes retaliating for Houthi missile fire or drones being fired on Israel. And in both cases, it's a limited operation. It has a few targets. It's one wave because it's 1,800 miles, and it requires mid-air refueling, and it's just the size of the Israeli Air Force isn't as big as we can't sort of compare that capability with the U.S. The U.S. has massive air power that it can deploy anywhere in the world. That's not the case with Israel. Now, if you look at Iran, Iran is at 1,200 miles distance. And, the Israeli Air Force, again, in my view, and I could be proven wrong, but I'm pretty sure that the Israeli Air Force does not have the capability for a sustained airstrikes campaign on Iran because Iran is a big country. It's not only 1,200 miles away from Israel, but it's a big country. Targets are dispersed. The nuclear facilities are dispersed over a wide geography. You need mid-air refueling, at a very big scale. You need aircraft. You need intelligence assistance. And that's what Naftali Bennett is talking about, that look, we can't do it without the United States. So yes, they need the United States to come to their aid in order to counter the threat from Iran that Iran poses. So yeah, I mean, this is not a secret that they are trying to, at least for this administration, the government of Bibi Netanyahu is trying to get the US involved. But the United States, in my view, will look at things from its own strategic interests. And that's sort of where there's a natural divergence of interest. So yes, there's support for Israel because it's an ally. And if that ally is fighting a common adversary like Iran and its non-state actor proxies, then that sort of support becomes even more solidified. But at the end of the day, the United States does not look at Iran or this region in the way the Israelis do or can. For the Israelis, they live there. This is where they are, and their calculus, their perspective is completely different than an American perspective. And this isn't the only theater, going back to the conversation that we're having, is the United States has to operate on multiple levels. The United States has to make sure the Russians don't keep punching into Western Ukraine. The United States needs to make sure that whatever the Chinese are doing remains contained and deal with the Middle East as well. So there is an attempt to pull the U.S. in, but I think that the United States knows its limits. It'll go so far, and you see that. You see that from the statements, and then politics has a way of really confusing policymaking, or at least what to the outside people, you can't sort of disentangle and say, okay, so what's really happening here? Because everything is so politicized, especially in this day and age of social media. And we're now what, 35 years out from the 24/7 news cycle. So it's very difficult to see what's really happening. That's where you got to do some empathetic analysis and say, okay, what's really in it for the US? Does the US really want to go wage war? Now, look, don't get me wrong. If Hezbollah, was an enemy of the United States before it became an enemy of Israel, there's a history there. So if Hezbollah is being degraded, the United States is not going to shed a tear. In fact, the United States will say, "Great, this is in our interest. The Israelis are taking care of this. Then we can support them in whatever way we can." Same thing with Iran. But then Iran is not Hezbollah. It's not a non-state actor. Iran is a nation. At the end of the day, I mean, even Trump came out like in the last few days and was asked, "Would you make a deal with the Iranians?" He said, "Yes,
Yeah.
that I would." And because at the end of the day, regardless whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, all conflicts have to come to an end. This is the same Donald Trump who said, "Let's do a deal with the Taliban." Now, it ended up very badly. But what I'm saying is that this idea that the United States would somehow continue to go along with an ally, even an ally as close as Israel, I think it's a bit far-fetched. It's actually quite far-fetched because US has its own interests.
Yeah, and it does. And so let's just focus on the United States, right? Because again, that's like where it's hard to disentangle politics from policy, primarily also because in a system like the United States, politics does play a role. Congress asserts its own role, lobby interest groups play their role, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things that I've been wondering about, right, is looking at the two main sort of foreign policy camps in the two main parties. I see the Republicans, because of Donald Trump's influence on the party, talking about sort of the Ukraine war being something that we don't really necessarily need to be involved with, which is very vehemently opposed in the town you and I live and breathe the air in, Washington, D.C., right? There's a full-throated support in the Washington Beltway consensus view of full support for Ukraine. Some even say let them use their weapons, our weapons, to attack Russia, etc. But the Trump sort of edgy foreign policy guys and women say, well, they question that. And they don't say it in the right way, but they kind of like align with the Mearsheimer view, right? Like you have three competing great powers in the world. The United States is the dominant one. The Russians are a declining one. The Chinese are the rising one. And in that play, like you want to keep the declining power on your side to keep the rising one in check. And therefore, Russia should not be antagonized in the way, which is similar to this conversation back in the Iraq war days, etc., that some people used to make, especially in the Obama camp, that it's better to engage with Iran and have a deal with Iran because an Iran that is sort of neutral, not super antagonistic to the United States, is actually good for our interests as we look towards the East into East Asia and try to control China, right? We don't want to push them into the Russian-Chinese axis by default. But we have this consensus, particularly in the Democrats and to an extent in the establishment Republican foreign policy view of things, that there is a block of revisionist powers. I'm sure you read Anthony Blinken's latest foreign affairs essay where he was patting himself on the back. I don't know why, but very interesting that he did that, where he sees these revisionist powers, right? China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea as being part of. He doesn't say, he's like, we don't believe in bloc politics, but still these are the revisionist powers and they're collaborating and colluding. How do you assess the mainstream Beltway foreign policy geopolitical view of this changing world order, where the relative power balance is shrinking, where asymmetric means are increasingly having an impact, and the United States is stretched thin now in three theaters: the European theater, the Middle Eastern theater, and the East Asian theater. And it seems intent, the foreign policy blob essentially seems intent on making sure that the United States continues to be, at odds in all these three regions without realizing that this is not that easy to do anymore. How do you see this view of this consensus in Washington?
Yeah, I mean, you and I have talked offline on this, so for the benefit of the viewers and the listeners, look, the way in which this consensus operates, the principles that it operates on are roughly 80 years old. They are operating within paradigms, within sort of established protocols that go back to the Second World War. And those were great to win the United States won the Cold War because of that. But this is a new world. And this is, I guess, this is the conversation that we're having, you and I, about asymmetric warfare, tech, the rise of non-state actors, and their ability to challenge established conventional militaries. So I think that thinking is still clouding. I think that we're now due for a change in the way we operate. So I was listening to a Republican who is not establishment Republican, who made a very compelling argument. I mean, he said, look, why do we need so many aircraft carriers? Because in an age of swarming drones, the aircraft carrier provides for a target-rich environment. Now, I'm not a military analyst per se, but logically that makes sense. So why are we fighting yesterday's wars or fighting today's wars with the tools and the approaches of the past? So there is a need to update. So yeah, I mean, I don't think that the Trump camp does a good job. Actually, I think it does a very poor job of explaining its position. But the argument is valid in the case of Ukraine. It's a simple question that a voter asks, in a red state, that how long shall we pay the Ukrainians before they are, what is sort of that end game? Are we, will there be victory in 5 years, 2 years? How long do we keep doing this? Now, there are those who would say from the Democratic side, and they also do have an argument that, the amount of money that we're spending there is very little compared to, the entire budget, the military budget of the United States, the aid that we're providing. But the thing is that in the end, there's a big question to ask. Will there ever be a scenario in the immediate foreseeable future where Ukraine, with American weapons, will be able to take back all the territory that the Russians have occupied? And if the answer to that is, well, maybe in 4 years or 5 years, well, for the voter, that's not good enough, because the voter says, we got, dilapidated infrastructure in this country. I don't have, good health care. My needs are local. Why are we spending? And someone like a Donald Trump, makes a convincing argument to those people, even if he can't speak in the sophisticated way that you and I and the rest of this town and the intelligentsia, at least the liberal, college-educated, urban intelligentsia, is used to. So, but it makes an argument. Then the question is that all conflicts come to an end in a negotiated settlement. So, do you want to continue fighting this war? What if the Russians, if you keep fighting, you keep giving more money, what if the Russians start to take more territory? In other words, the effect of a prolonged war is favorable to the Russians, not the West. Then what?
Which historically, like going by Russian history, right? This is their way of fighting war, grind out the enemy. This is what they did with Napoleon. They were struggling very early on and then ground them out, burnt Moscow as the Napoleonic army was coming in, starved them in the winter, and then Napoleon sort of lost power as a result of that. Second World War, same thing. Stalin bungled the initial part of it, but they ground out the Nazi army over time, right? And that's how that the countries and nations have their ways of war, and it seems like this is the Russian way of war.
So yeah, absolutely. Great points, because then comes back to the question of, so how long do we keep doing this? Why are we doing this the old way? Okay. I don't claim to have all the solutions. I don't think anybody has all the solutions, but there's a need for out of the box thinking. There's a need to move away from old paradigms that held true, for a while, for a long while, but not anymore. We are now, in an age where intelligence, there used to be a time not long ago when proprietary intelligence from closed sources was seen as sort of like very valuable. Anymore in this day and age, and especially now with AI ramping up, you have the domain of OSINT is where most intelligence is, the open sources. So this is a new world. If you're going to, I mean, it will require its own approach to conflict management, conflict resolution. So I don't think that we're really thinking this through, and the establishment has to evolve. We can't keep fighting future wars based on the protocols of past decades. So there is an argument to be made. So I'm one of those who says, look, separate the politics and let's talk about, what are we looking at geopolitically? What kind of policy? So the problem in the town that we live in, Ozair, is that policy is made through the lens of ideology. If you're a conservative, you will openly say we need a conservative policy on so and so, whether it's domestic or foreign policy. Likewise, on the left, they have the same perspective. I think it's high time that American foreign policymakers and this whole policymaking space really goes back and says, well, let's just do the analysis first. Let's look at things geopolitically. Let's, have the best practices and then sort of distill what solutions we can come up with. But unfortunately, That's not going to happen anytime soon. And, we're just going to have to ride this thing out until it's no longer valid. The good thing is that this country is built on the idea of reinvention, and nothing lasts forever. There are no sacred, there are no holy cows. There are no sacred, nothing is sacred here. Solutions, they may not, there'll be resistance to solutions. It happens all the time, but eventually, people get disabused. And we're in that patch right now where the old principles, the old way of doing things isn't solving the problems, and we don't have new solutions just yet. Hence the chaos.
That's a very important point. I think the only thing that makes me a bit, less optimistic about this change is that at least, and you've seen this, I've sort of read about it for like half this time, right? But for the last 30 years of American foreign policy, um, people who pursued and pushed terrible choices on this country, in Afghanistan, in Iraq in particular, supposed throughout this 21st century, essentially, have failed upwards. And that doesn't give me hope, is the fact that the people who are responsible for the blunders of yesterday are in fact still considered the sane, important voices to conduct the blunders of tomorrow. This is what frustrates me so much, but that's where we are, I guess, right now.
Are you alluding to the fact that we should, set politics aside and take, our political opponents seriously?
Yeah, I mean, it's also like I subscribe to this. I don't know if you read the book Skin in the Game by Nassim Taleb, right? But I think I mentioned that to you yesterday. The term intellectual yet idiot comes from that term, and he came up with that. It's a great book, but he makes a very valid point, like compares history, right? His view was that the problem with American foreign policy in particular now is that back in the day, if you look at the Roman Empire, any empire or any sort of like war that is being fought, the people making war making policy often, not always, but often were on the front lines, which meant that if you messed it up, you were going to be the first person whose head was going to be on a pike, right? You look at the first Anglo-Afghan war with Burns and stuff, and like they all paid for their blunder, for example. It's just one case I'm mentioning right now. And Nassim Taleb's view is that the problem in Washington now is that not only do you make blunders, but you get enriched by those blunders and you don't pay for the consequences anyway whatsoever, which means that you think you're even smarter the next time around and you make an even bigger blunder, which is like, I think he captured that really well. But moving on this point, right? Like if I then look at, you mentioned that the Chinese interest is to grow economically, and continue to maintain some level of peace in the region and maintain their economic trajectory. Their economy is not doing so well. And then the Russians obviously are trying to grind out in Ukraine. I want to hear your point of view on sort of the dynamics of these two powers in particular, right? Because I think also in this moment of time, particularly in sort of the Western conversation, there's been this view that, oh, the authoritarian playbook essentially is much more effective. Look at the Chinese way of governance. They get things done, they build things quickly. Russia to a lesser extent, but there's some in the fringes of American political society and media. There's a sort of like, they view with rose-tinted glasses somebody like Vladimir Putin. My view on this is that authoritarians actually become significantly weaker over time, primarily because the more power they accumulate and as they age, the more terrible are the choices that they will make without good guidance. And eventually they do go away, whether through an internal coup or through their own natural causes and death. And in both cases, history teaches us that chaos ensues. How do you see that playing out in a place like China and Russia, given the increased centralization of power that has happened under Xi and Putin?
That's a great question, and let's focus on Russia for a moment. If you, I look at Russia as an unsettled, I'm talking about the Russian Federation since the Soviet implosion. I look at that as a polity still in the making. And why do I say that? Because there was that near decade, from almost decade, from 1991 December to, I think it was March 2000, when Putin became president. That interregnum was chaotic. And, the Clinton administration was hoping that they could sort of steer Moscow, more towards the West. Nobody was under the illusion that this was going to become, a democratic state anytime soon, because the establishment actually didn't go away, the physical establishment, which is, the intelligence services in the case of the Russian state, the Kremlin. Now, in come 2000, you have the rise of Putin. Putin is someone who comes in and stabilizes the Russian Federation. The Russian Federation, and it's interesting to see, Putin is really, he has no love for the Communist Party or the communist, if you will, face of Russia during the time of the Soviet Union. But what he is very much interested in, and what he yearns for, is the restoration of empire.
He's a traditional imperialist from the Russian point of view.
Exactly. So he's not, yes, he came out of the Soviet legacy, the communist legacy. He came through the intelligence services, the KGB, but he is very clear that communism was a disaster, but we can still have an empire and we can do it. And he's been trying to do that. Now we have to put this into context. So as soon as he comes to power, within a year and a half, 9/11 happens. And the United States, for the next good 15 to 20 years, its strategic focus shrinks from a global scale to a very limited battle space that stretches from the Middle East through South Asia. And the United States is dealing with that. In the meantime, that creates an opportunity for Russia to revive itself. And Russia, becomes the power that, we've seen it become since 2000, in the 20 years, in the generation since, until the disastrous performance of the Russian military on the Ukrainian battlefields.
Just to sort of, for the audience, right, in terms of timeline, right, he goes very systematically in doing that and stabilizing and then taking care of things. Chechnya stabilizes that. I mean, I'm using stabilize before people start hating on. Yes, it was a very brutal war. I'm just saying, in the Russian view, stabilizes the Chechen situation, stabilizes the economy, expands reserve holdings, uses that to embark on military modernization, then starts encroaching into old school Soviet territory like Georgia, and then finally culminates into Ukraine, where you are saying a disaster unfolds for him.
Yeah. And one of the things that we tend to ignore, and especially the Washington establishment, is sort of an empathetic analysis. So people, it's funny how if you start to engage in empathetic analysis, people think that you're borderline sympathetic or you're making justifications and excuses for the adversary. There's a marked difference between explanation and justification. I just wanted to put that out there. But yes, he does start the process of rebuilding Russia's, basically regaining control over Russia's near abroad. Ukraine, whether it was Tsarist Russia, whether it was the Soviet Union, whether it's this Putin regime, Ukraine is the strategic front yard of Russia. Ukraine is that area that protects it historically, because what you have on the other side of Ukraine is a invasion superhighway, the northern European plain that runs from Poland all the way to through Western Europe, the northern rim of Europe. That's where, you mentioned Napoleon invaded, the Third Reich, Nazi war machine. So that is critical. We forgot that, there was going to be an orange revolution. There was an orange revolution in 2005 in Ukraine. And then, we thought, democracy is spreading. And we thought that, it's all good times because we were drinking the Kool-Aid of, the end of history. So, but the reality is, from a Russian point of view, Russia cannot give up on Ukraine. And it will do everything in its power to retain it. Ukraine also is where you project power, because not only is it you're the buffer that protects you from the West, whatever's on the West. Different regimes have come historically, but from a Russian point of view, that's a vulnerability. But it's also where Russia projects power. It allows it to project power into the Black Sea. Now, notice the Ukrainians have really give a beating to the Black Sea fleet of Russia because the Russians, despite the fact they control Crimea, and they've created the land bridge between Crimea and Donbass. But nonetheless, the Ukrainians have been able to really give a hard time to the Russian Navy, because it's the Black Sea is where it projects power and historically. So this is something that we don't factor into our analysis when we're trying to understand why Russia is expending so many resources. Not to say that it's a good thing or the Russians should do it, but you need to understand why are they behaving the way they are. It's easy to say, oh, they're autocrats. Oh, this is a brutal regime and it's an invasion and whatnot. That's all very true, but that's not why they're doing it. They're doing it because of a threat, and then of course opportunity in the future once they've neutralized the threat. So I think now moving forward, given what's happened in Ukraine, and right now we're in a weird moment where the Russians seem ascendant or on the rise again, on the move again. But Putin, let's just put it this way: Putin's best days are behind him. He did what he could. He brought Russia back into great power status after the fall of the Soviet Union. He's now, what, 24 years into power? He's not going to be around for long. The question is, does the Russian Federation is synonymous with the Putin regime. Is there a Russian Federation that is post-Putin, and what does it look like in the context of global sanctions, in the context of the difficult situation in Ukraine, and the fact that the Chinese are now filling the strategic vacuum that Russia is leaving behind in Central Asia. The Turks have already benefited from the Russian inability to play in the South Caucasus with the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict. So there is that's where I see the Russians headed. The Chinese, unless you have another question, I'd like to get into the
No,
Chinese.
get into the Chinese because this was fascinating.
Because if you look at China, China is going back to what you said earlier, which was very important, is that autocratic regimes are efficient. So I go to Central Asia a lot, and Central Asian states are eager to have Western investment. And one of the things that Westerners and even people like myself argue is you can't look at the United States the way you look at China. The Chinese state can write a big check and invest tens of hundreds of billions of dollars into a project. The American government doesn't behave like that. It's the private sector that has to come in. It has to make business sense. So the situation with China is that it is very efficient because of the nature of the regime. I agree with you. Long term, it flounders, as we are seeing right now. With you see, you kind of like you can't have your cake and eat it. So what the Communist Party of China has done is basically say, we're going to adapt to capitalism within our framework, but we're not going to become, we're not going to lose who we are. Now, that's a difficult thing to do. And especially if you have a situation where what made China successful was a very bureaucratized, institutionalized regime. The Chinese Communist Party provided for that structure. And it's a collective leadership at multiple levels with lots of institutions, and it was a fairly institutionalized state. And that the successors of Mao, especially with the rapprochement or the détente with the U.S. during the Nixon administration, and by the 1980s and definitely by the 90s, the relationship flowered, where the United States invested both in financial and technological terms, and the Chinese economy grew. Now, what is happening under Xi is that when Xi came to power, we already had the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And you no longer have those near double-digit, GDP growth figures. And it's cyclical as well. You being, someone who focuses on economics more than I do and finance, will know this far better than I, that it's hard to sustain that kind of growth. In the beginning, there's a lot of growth, but at some point it plateaus. But if you're hit by a financial crisis, a global financial crisis, because your entire economy is built, you're the world's industrial plant, and your economy grows on exports, and the world is in recession, the demand goes down, you can't export, and then what is the social contract of the Chinese Communist Party with its own people? Is that don't talk about politics, but we will give you, unparalleled prosperity, and we will, make you proud of being Chinese. That had already happened. And that's where Xi comes in. Now, yes, people are power hungry. There are people individuals who see themselves bigger than the regime that they inherited. And you see Xi doing that with his third term and the purges that continue. And we see all of that. But ultimately, what is happening to China under Xi is the demise of that collective leadership, is the demise of the institutionalized, bureaucratized regime, and it is being built around an individual. And it was done because one could argue that he sees that he can't maintain those growth levels, but he needs to maintain control of, make sure that the regime is not weakening. And therefore, he needs to personalize, have personal control, and make it more authoritarian or more totalitarian. And that's his plan. The problem is it isn't working. It hasn't worked. And the economic news, the bad economic news that keeps coming from China speaks volumes about the failures of Xi. At some point, this is untenable. Either the Chinese will have to fold, in my opinion, in the sense that they can't keep, being an aggressive force, and they reach an understanding with the United States, and they rebuild that relationship, and they reach that, trade understanding, and they want those investments, and then that stabilizes the regime. Or they don't, and it ends up in a conflict, and which is going to be bad for the regime internally as well, because you can't be fighting on the external front while your economy is slipping on the domestic front.
That's very interesting, right? So because as you were concluding that point, I was thinking about like scenarios, which I was going to ask you about. But the scenario then, the most logical scenario that comes to my mind, right? If you look at these three powers as we've discussed them, the United States clearly has a political problem internally. These elections, the transition of power will be very interesting to watch, and you and I will be glued to our screens to see what happens in the next 6 weeks or so. But clearly, the demand from the population in the United States is focus at home. Enough of these foreign wars, enough of these blank checks for military endeavors. We're done with this. You've spent 25 years of the 21st century doing this. Stop it. Fair enough. You see Russia, as you explained, Putin's good days behind him. Now the Russian Federation has to figure out a pathway to build off of or consolidate what Putin has done and deal with some of the damage he's caused internally as well because of sanctions, etc. And the Russian elite have a choice to make of saying, okay, at some point we gotta look inwards and start fixing some of the crap that we have on our hand, thanks to Putin's, expansionist views in Ukraine, etc. And then the same with the Chinese, where Xi has made mistakes, particularly post-COVID. He's being pressured because the United States is forcing supply chains to shift, and et cetera, et cetera. So again, the incentive is to look inwards and figure out where we go from here, right? Because we're not done. The optimist in me would say that elites in all three of these powers will look at that and look at these signals and say, let's look inwards and sort of call a timeout for now and hold this pattern where we are globally in this chessboard and see what comes next in the next round of things, decade or so later. That's one scenario, but I was curious from your point of view, what are some scenarios you're looking at or thinking about as this current status, right? We're in this moment of flux, increasing conflict in different parts of the world, as we've talked about, great powers facing their own limitations or experiencing their own limitations of their own power. Where do you think we go from here in terms of scenarios?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So let's start with China. Because China has no history of major conflict. I mean, there was a war with Vietnam. It didn't last long, and that was decades ago. And then there was a war in 62 with India, which was largely on the Himalayas. The Chinese military does not have a history of deploying multi-divisional forces beyond its borders. So one of the things that people don't realize is that having more hardware is just half the job. There's the humanware. The humanware comes with experience. So if you're going to do blue water navigation, you definitely need all the hardware that you can get. And the Chinese are building that faster than the United States because they have a lot of catching up to do. And because, the United States has to evolve beyond what we talked about, the old ways of doing things. But the Chinese do not have sort of that experience of admiralty. They're now embarking on that with all these war games. They're practicing, but these are still war games. One of the paradoxes of military strength is that it's built through conflict. You can't do simulations and hope to be able to win an actual war. I think because of that, because of the fragile political economic situation within China and its needs to ease trade restrictions, have more investments. There's investments that are slowly being redirected to places like India, needs to stop. The restrictions on technology that are being imposed also needs to, stop from the Chinese point of view. I think that we're less likely to see a conflict with China, at least for a while. Now, miscalculations happen and things go out of hand. I am not ruling that out. I'm just sort of looking at the fundamentals and saying, if I was a Chinese strategist, and what would I be thinking about? Knowing all this. I mean, one of the things that we try, what most people do, even those who are very thoughtful, is we sort of think that, people are stupid. Uh, Empathetic analysis, at least to me, teaches that don't underestimate anybody. And if you're gaming out, then assume the others are gaming out. They know who they are. They may project something different, but they know their reality better than anybody else. And they're going to be rational most of the time, miscalculations notwithstanding. So I
I
think that
mean, on this point, right? But I would sort of counter that, and you said there are exceptions and miscalculations happen. I think the chances of a miscalculation happening, let's say in a more old school consensus dominated Chinese governance system, the chances of miscalculation happening in that system are far lower than what they are right now because of this centralization of power that she has done, right? I mean, you and I are both from Pakistan. Ayub Khan made that blunder in 1965. We know about that. Saddam Hussein with Kuwait made that blunder, paid terrible price for that. So centralized power, particularly with men who have an outsized view of their own role in history, particularly in terms of what they can do for their nation, can dramatically increases, in my view, the chances of a bad move happening here. But I broadly agree. Yes, from a rational, logical point of view, the advisors around Xi probably are like, we're not there yet.
even Xi himself, and I'm with you. I'm with you and you make an excellent point that, hey, look, if it's becoming personalized and if Xi is becoming sort of the one-man show, then the chances of those miscalculations and
Or
getting in.
group thing, if I may add, people would say, "Oh, you didn't say America," but under George Bush, the United States and the neocons are a case in point of a group think can lead to that as well.
Of course, and I would add sycophancy. People who are sycophants who are saying, "Oh, sir, you are the greatest thing that has happened to this country since Mao," and therefore, they tell him things that he's not supposed to be told, but he's misled. But I think that there's also the other side that if you could potentially get away with a gamble, but there's an equal probability that you'd be worse off. So in other words, you're trying to stay in power, maintain regime preservation, uh, but your action could lead you there. So I think that we shouldn't sort of preclude the possibility that these calculations are made while the probability of miscalculation remains significant. So there's that. Now, if you go, let's switch to Russia. Russia, I think that we're looking at, I think it could get worse. Why do I say that? Because for a number of factors. One is what we've already talked about, that Russia has historically this tendency to bounce back from very bad military situations. So let's assume for the moment that they begin to push deeper into Ukraine. Then we're looking at a big conflict with the West, and things can get out of hand. The other thing here is that Russia is a military power. It is the second largest military power of the world with its own industrial base, and it has a history of combat going
And
back centuries.
they've been warming up from Chechnya onwards, right? Unlike the Chinese who don't have that match practice, so to speak.
Exactly, exactly. So and then so there is a precedent there, and it's more sort of, let's just put it this way, nothing is sort of, well, I don't want to say it's zero sum, but it's near zero sum because you if the US and the West cannot protect the current regime in Ukraine, then Russia is on the doorsteps of Europe, Poland, NATO. Conversely, if the Russians do not create a buffer zone that they can live with, then NATO is on its doorstep.
Plus,
So
their political history is full of, you lose a war and the entire regime, including the man on top, goes away because that's just the Russian history. That's what it teaches
yeah,
us.
the political culture of the Russians is far different than that of the Chinese. The Chinese MO is that we go in and we do business. The Russians do business, but the Russians also uh, have a history of being an imperial power, and a successful one for a quite long time. So I think there's the risk of conflict in the Russian European theater is much more greater than it is in China. Let's come to Iran. I think Iran is also similar to the Russian situation because Iran is a regime that is losing its influence, its sphere of influence that it has built over the last 4 decades, at the same time that it is undergoing internal regime evolution. And so the possibility of miscalculation, and Iran is also a very aggressive revisionist state.
If I may ask you really quickly for like 30, 60 seconds, just explain to those on the audience who don't understand what the internal political evolution in Iran is. I know Khamenei is old, but beyond that, not a lot of people are in the weeds, and you are. So just explain what this evolution entails right now.
Yeah, for the full version, there's my report on the New Lines Institute website called Post Khamenei Iran. It's a detailed study that we published back in April. It's basically what is happening is this isn't the impending death of a supreme leader, an individual. This is a supreme leader who has had far more influence in shaping the regime than the founder himself, Khomeini. Khamenei has been in power for 35 some years. The whole regime is literally built around him, and he's handpicked people who are on the top. He's created institutions from scratch. And therefore, when he passes, that's going to be a significant transition. The next supreme leader will not enjoy the same amount of control and influence over the regime that his predecessor had. On top of that, the clergy has completely weakened, for a variety of reasons that I go into in my report. And the rise of the military, at least over the last 20 years, is for everyone to see. The military is now involved in every sector of the state and society. So this is going to become a more military-dominated regime. But it's not as simple as, the locus of power shifting from the clergy to the military, because you have two militaries. You have the IRGC, numerically smaller, roughly 220,000 men in uniform, and then the regular armed forces, the Artesh, around 350,000. And yes, there's the Basij militia and whatnot that the IRGC can rely on. But ultimately, if this is going to become a military-dominated regime, then there has to be an internal power sharing understanding between the regular armed forces, which is less ideological, more professional than the IRGC. So they have their homework and their work cut out for them in terms of how they're going to do that. And so this is a historic transition. This regime is about to change. And then there is so much public pressure because yes, the regime still has its 10-15% supporters, but Iran is a country of at least 80 million people, if not more. Most people were not born when the revolution took place. Most people in this country, like other countries, has a huge youth bulge. All they remember about the regime is that it's brutal, it suppresses people, it forces religion on them, and it's spending way more money on the foreign policy front than it is on, in terms of managing the domestic political economy, and is engaged in unnecessary conflict with its neighbors, but more importantly, with the United States.
Where also it's at the same time, its sphere of influence is shrinking while people are upset about it investing so much in that.
Exactly. And then the fragility of the Middle East. Arab states are by and large inert in terms of being able to fend for their own national security. Turkey is still not able to project influence into this region as so that there could be a counterweight to Iran. Israel, in the last 6 months, has been pushing back and basically degrading that sphere of influence, but it can only do so much. And so this is a recipe for conflict. So, in an ideal world, the fact that they now have a reformist president who was allowed by the establishment to run for office and win, because if they didn't want it, he wouldn't be there, which suggests that there may be, a need to rationalize. And at the end of the day, the Iranians have come as far as they could. They've peaked and now they're on the downward side. And this has been happening for the past decade because there was a reason why they did the nuclear deal with the Obama administration, because they can no longer maintain the outlays, the financial outlays on the foreign policy front while maintaining domestic tranquility on the home front. So they need sanctions respite. How do they go from this very, aggressive, radical foreign policy agenda to actually reaching an understanding with the United States? That's a very, very tricky, if you will, pathway. It's not linear. There's no guarantee that they will get there. In other words, we're looking at conflict. So to sum up, I don't see China becoming a conflict zone with the US just yet. It will take some time. Russia is at huge risk. because of what's happening there and because of the underlying logic. And the Middle East, we're watching it unfold as the days go by.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, and perhaps I'll end this with my last question being focused at home with elections coming up, right? Because if your scenario, the base case scenarios you laid out, play out in the way you explained them, then that means the ability and willingness of the American public to sustain even more conflict in the Middle East and Ukraine will be tested at a time when the country is deeply polarized. And of course, the elections will inform much of those choices and the way they are made. But what do you see happening in Washington, given that there's a, in my view at least, I don't know if you agree or disagree, there's a big disconnect between the American people and America's foreign policy elites in terms of what to do about the Middle East and Western Europe.
Yeah, look, first, I hope whoever wins clearly, and there are no doubts. So for all our sakes, with a clear sort of margin where there is no room for misinterpretation and any chaos. So having said that, George W. Bush won against Al Gore, and there was that controversy over the votes in Florida. And the Supreme Court ruled, and then, it was clear that the Bush campaign had won, and he became president. Within months of taking office, at the commencement speech that he gave, I think it was at West Point in June of 2000 or May of 2001, he said, we have no business. That entire speech was, or most of it was, we have no business doing nation building. But then 9/11 happened. And he ended up doing nation building. What I'm trying to say here is that there are campaign promises that are made in order to maximize. That's just the logic of politics in democratic societies. You want, especially when it's so polarized, especially when it's so close, the race, you promise everything in order to maximize those votes. When you enter office, a new reality sets in. The more astute politician, he or she will make sure that they can bridge the gap between electoral promises, campaign promises, and actual policy deliverables. That doesn't happen very often. But if you just look at the behavior of Donald Trump, you see some interesting statements coming from him. And I'm one of those who sort of says, pay very little attention to what people are saying. But these were sort of noteworthy because they are uncharacteristic of what we know about Donald Trump's politics, both on the domestic front and the foreign policy. He began to say, in his crude way, that this is very bad for Israel, what Israel is doing. He needs to end the war and end it fast. He obviously can't articulate it to where, it makes sense for a whole lot of people. But
Maybe
essentially,
even to not even to fifth graders, maybe because that's how he speaks.
that's just how he speaks. That's just the man we're dealing with. But he's basically saying, bring this to an end. Why? Because there's a good chance this will become his problem. And then he has to deal with it. There's no more campaigns. There's the job to do. And you said an end to forever wars. And that's what you want. That is what you have been, you want to do. Not just you have promised, but it's exactly what you want to do. So he's mindful. Again, now this going back to the very interesting, intriguing statement about would you make a deal with Iran? And he says, yeah, I would, Why is he saying that? Because he's seeing, again, this problem becoming his own. So I think that regardless of who wins, it could be that Donald Trump does not win. There's going to be reality that hits, the leadership, whether it's Democratic, whether it's future President Kamala Harris and her administration, or a second term for former President Donald Trump. They will have to deal with reality. And the reality is, there's one thing that's unmistakable about reality. It is brutal. And then all rhetoric and all sort of posturing, will have to be set aside to deal with real problems. Will they make mistakes? Absolutely. It's part of, the game. So I think that the big question is that can we not have a repeat of there was fraud in the election. So that's what I'm looking at. Once we get beyond that, and it's clear who won, and we can get to inauguration, I think that it, it's whoever wins will have to deal with reality and will have to move beyond the business as usual, the same old tools that you and I just talked about that are not working. Will whoever wins, on November 5th be able to do that? I have my doubts, but they will be forced to move into that direction. This is why I'm not so hopeful of this election, and I'm more looking at the 2028 election when you'll have a new set of characters. The Republican Party would have changed, and maybe perhaps there will be more competition inside the Democratic Party. Who knows? But I think that we need to get through the 2020s, the mess of the 2020s.
Somehow, the 20s in the last 2 centuries have been problematic for humanity. Seems like we're only halfway through it, so it's a long way to go. But thank you so much for your wonderful insights and for taking out so much time to answer my questions and discuss this topic. I learned a lot, and I'm sure the audience did as well. And you and I will keep chatting offline as more and more developments happen. So, keep the analysis coming, and I'll link in the description to your recent pieces, including the Iran report, for people to check it out. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.